Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Atomi Brainwaves, our podcast on education for educators. Brainwaves is produced by our wonderful team here at Atomi, an online teaching and learning platform for secondary education. We provide engaging, curriculum-specific videos and text lessons for over 190 subjects, as well as matching quizzes and exam practice that can be used for both learning and formative assessment. We also provide powerful analytics that can help teachers diagnose how their students are progressing and zero in on who might need a little bit of extra help. We aim to make life easier for teachers, give them more time to work on the most important things, and ultimately help to generate better outcomes. If you'd like to find out more about Atomi, head over to getatomi.com and feel free to give it a go for free. Today, I had the pleasure of talking to James Nottingham, author, keynote speaker, and founder of the Learning Pit and the Challenging Learning Group. We discussed the vital role of feedback in the educational process and how to correctly use it, and explored in depth the challenging learning process employed by James to bring positive improvement across hundreds of schools in Europe, North America, and the Asia Pacific. If that sounds like your kind of thing, make sure to subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you like to do your listening. And why not leave a 5-star review while you're there? For now, have a listen and enjoy.
Are you going to teach us anything?
What, you want me to teach you something? You want to learn something? All right. You got it!
Welcome back to Atomi Brainwaves. I'm your host Simon, and today I'm joined by our very special guest, James Nottingham, creator of the Learning Pit and founder of the Challenging Learning Group, which serves as a host of clients across Europe, North America, and Asia Pacific, world-renowned keynote speaker, and author of 9 books about teaching, learning, and leadership. Welcome, James.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's lovely to be with you.
Lovely to have you on. Also lovely to have, as we were just discussing there before recording, a guest in the same time zone as me. This is a This is a first for the podcast.
Great. Brilliant.
Yes.
Just waving across the Irish Sea to you right now.
I know, just across the Irish Sea, much better than across multiple continents as it usually is.
Absolutely.
Back to I hope the folks in Australia aren't annoyed when they hear this. Always great to work across that time difference too, but lovely to have this rare occurrence of the same time zone. So we're going to dive into your kind of area of expertise, which is the idea of challenging learning as we go along through the pod. But before we do, whenever we have a guest on, we like to start by just getting a run through of your journey in education, kind of where you started from, the different twists and turns along the road, and how you ended up where you are today.
Sure. I think it's probably worth saying that I hated school. I loved primary school, I think. I went to about 10 or 12 different primary schools. I was a part of a military family, so we moved around and around and around. And then I went to secondary school and I absolutely hated the thing. And in fact got kicked out of 2 secondary schools for bad behaviour. And I wasn't engaged. I didn't enjoy it. I didn't see the point in it. I felt that it was fairly irrelevant stuff that we were going through. And I rebelled against it. And my mother had died when I was young, and my father was off in the military. So it was I got away with it as well. I managed to intercept any school report that went towards our house and any letter that came from the headmaster to say that I'd been expelled or suspended. I was able to intercept that. So I pretty much hated secondary. And the best day of my school life was the day I left secondary. And then thought, well, what will I do? And of course, I didn't have qualifications enough to get into anything particularly. So I worked on a pig farm and worked in a chemical factory. And then a mate of mine said he's off down to South Africa to do some volunteer work. It was still apartheid South Africa then. It was the late 80s. And I said, well, got nothing else to do, I'll come with you. And off we went.
Might as well.
Might as well, yeah. And we lived in Lange, which is one of the townships outside of Cape Town. and did a lot of charity work with men's hostels, women's cooperatives, and so on. And then one of the things we did was to work in a school, and I just loved it. And there was me, having hated school, then loving it and building a rapport with kids pretty quickly. But I felt bad that I felt as if I was learning more than the kids were from me. I had no qualifications and certainly no experience in teaching, and I vowed then that if I ever got the opportunity, I'd come back and do something where I did have something to offer. And I came back and I got a job in a school for deaf children as a childcare officer. And I'd get the kids up and off to school, and then I'd pick them up after school and basically be their parent evenings and weekends. This is a residential school. And eventually went from there to train to be a teacher. And I was very, very hesitant about that, but I went anyway. Mainly because I wanted to continue working with kids, not that I wanted to study anymore, but that I wanted to work with kids. And then there was a guy there at the university who had just trained in philosophy for children, and it's a way of engaging students in not so much thinking about the information, but thinking about the reasons and the questions and wondering. And it turned my idea of education upside down. It seemed to me that it's so much more exciting if we can look at how we think rather than necessarily what we think and what assumptions we're making and what the bigger picture might be and what conclusions we can draw and perhaps what misconceptions we have. And it was like a revelation. It really was fascinating. And so I trained in philosophy for children, and that really set me on the path that I'm on right now, that gave me this sense of education can be relevant and almost timeless. I mean, well, we could say timeless. It's a lot of philosophy for children comes from the Socratic method, and that's pretty old. Whereas the information I was learning at school, it just felt as if it was out of date. Even then, it was out of date. Never mind 10, 15, 20 years into the future, this knowledge that we were being given at school just seemed to be, I just didn't see the point. That's not to say I don't see the point in knowledge, but there was a certain amount of shelf life, whereas if we could learn how to think and how to investigate and how to converse and question and challenge, then it seemed to me that had a much greater sense of longevity about it. And so I used philosophy for children in my teaching. And then there was a short film made of that by Channel 4 over here, and that was televised, and a lot of schools got interested in what I was doing and how I was doing it. And then I was invited to work with a lot of schools to help them get it going, and it built from there. So now that we have, so that's evolved into challenging learning, and I chose that name, Challenging Learning, because of its double meaning. In the one sense, we want to challenge the way in which learning takes place, and what learning looks like and how it feels. We want to challenge that and cause students and teachers and parents to question it, but also to make learning more challenging. I think a lot of the problems that we've created in the last 20, 30 years or so, maybe even longer than that, have come from parents and maybe teachers, not desire so much as habit to make things easier for kids, because we've got to move them on, we've got to get them through the curriculum, we've got to get them to the answer
stages, in the
for
set
sure
path.
You know, and school life is segmented into 40-minute lessons in Australia particularly, or 50 or 60-minute lessons over here in the UK, You've got to get to the end of the lesson with the answer, and you've got to then move on. You've done English, now you go to maths, and then you go to science, and then you go to PE, and then it's boom, 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 and it's like, well, we've got to drag them along as quick as we can. And I think it's that age-old idea of easy come, easy go. And if we make it easier for them, they're actually more likely to forget it later on. And so the other part of challenging learning is, as well as challenging the way learning takes place, it's also about making learning more challenging. And by challenging, we don't necessarily mean difficult. We mean more engaging, more thought-provoking, more likely to cause people to think more, in this sense that if the more they think about it whilst they're taking part, whilst they're investigating, the longer that's going to last and the more likely they are to gain from it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really fascinating journey, which has led to some really fascinating conclusions. Just going back to what you were talking about there through that journey, it kind of always strikes me as kind of at first glance something somewhat ironic that when somebody who's a major figure in education, such as yourself, they say that, they hated their school years. At first glance, it seems counterintuitive, but would you say it's fair to say that having that experience probably put you in almost a better position in some ways to sort of, as opposed to someone who loves school and then would go into teaching and say, why would I change a thing? I love my school years. I want it to be the same for the kids that I teach. Would you say instead that someone like you, who was able to see all of the ways that the school system let you down, you're in almost a better position to see the changes and the challenges that need to be overcome as a result of having had that experience?
Certainly, for me, that would be absolutely true, Simon. I think it's a generalized point that we all have certain motivations, and the more the greater the depth of feeling about it, the more likely we are to put energy in. So it might well have been that I was totally and utterly inspired by, for example, a music teacher, and that music teacher had developed an amazing love and passion for music that I wanted to then share with as many students as possible. Now, that couldn't be further from the truth for me, but
there's time yet. There could be a music career right around the corner for you.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen. But for me, the drive was school did not work, and I thought it fairly irrelevant. Now, I saw there were great parts to it. I enjoyed the social part for sure. I enjoyed the sporting part for sure. And there were some great teachers in amongst all of it. But my drive, and I would probably say I am on a mission. I am on a mission to improve things, to change things, and I do have that drive. But we often see that. We often see the people who have really worked and worked and worked and worked. It comes from either that absolute joy and love, or that absolute desire to change the status quo, and I definitely fall into the latter category.
Yeah, and it should be noted that neither is necessarily better or worse than the other. I'm sure you could be an incredible teacher and execute great change if you are coming from that position of just the great experience in school and carrying that on. But yeah, it definitely sounds like it's a strong motivator to want to bring change, to have had to experience the other side of it.
Absolutely. And that it's a very important thing for me. And why philosophy for children stood out for me was twofold. One was it turned my idea of education upside down and gave me a sense of possibility that I had never seen before. But the other part was it gave the people taking part in philosophy for children a voice. And I had grown up relatively voiceless. And actually, I think that's why, looking back, that's why I rebelled so much. And that's why I was naughty, because I got attention, and some attention is better than no attention when you're struggling as a kid, particularly. And so when the teachers would send me out of class and say, I'll see you afterwards, I would actually think I'd won, because I would think, great, they're going to see me and they're going to ask me, why am I doing this? And it's going to be a one-on-one. And of course, I wouldn't have been able to articulate that back then, but looking back, it was a pretty strong motivator. And I think
Yeah.
there's so much we can learn from student voice. And I know that isn't an earth-shattering piece of news, because many of us do use student voice, but I think it's still worth reminding ourselves that
Yeah.
student voice, we can learn so much from it if we engage with our students and give time to listen to them. I did some. Our company, we mainly do long-term projects, and we've got a lot of long-term projects going in Australia right now, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria. And those long-term projects, they're over 2 or 3 years generally, and that's because we know that the coaching cycles are going to take some time, and the depth of understanding is going to take some time, and the change is going to take some time. And part of what we do in that process is we get to know the school, and we find out where they're at, and what their situation, what their context is, what their strengths are, what other things they want to improve. And we listen to teachers, and we listen to staff generally, and to students and parents. And we always ask for a cross section. We never ever want just the kids who love the school. We want a cross section. And so I was doing some student voice as part of that process to find out about this school. And I said, what helps you as a learner in this school? And this one kid said, well, I always look ahead to see what's coming next, and then I learn about it before the lesson. Now, this kid had recently arrived from South Korea, and the rest of the kids were Scottish and some English kids in there as well. And this kid from South Korea, had said, oh, well, I look ahead and then I learn what's coming up before the lesson. And the British kids were like irate. They were saying, well, you can't do that. That's cheating. and the Korean
Somehow
kids said,
against the rules.
Yeah, exactly. It's against the rules. And the Korean kids said, well, why is it against the rules? And they said, well, don't know really, but how do you know what to even look at? And he says, well, I don't, but I take a good guess. You know, if we've been doing fractions this week, then we might just be doing percentages next week, because it kind of one connects to the other. And I just look in the maths book, or I look in the English book, and so on. And one of the Scottish kids said, is that why you're so good at maths? And the Korean kid kind of shrugged and says, I don't know, I suppose so. And there was that sense of it would really help if we were given an idea of what's coming up next.
Yeah.
Not so that we can go and get all the answers and therefore not have to take part in the lesson, but much more so that we can become familiar before the lesson, so that we can engage much more. And to me, it was an absolute revelation. And I thought about all the subjects that I'd hated, and part of it was I didn't know how to engage. And let's take French. I saw French as brutally unfair in school, because it was the posh kids who got to go to France in the summer. They engaged in the lessons, and the rest of us basically sat around the outside and just did our own thing, because the French teachers only really engaged with the kids who enjoyed French, and they were the ones who had been to France in the summer holidays.
Yeah.
So we never quite knew how to engage. And I thought, if only I'd heard that South Korean kid saying that, what we could have said to the teacher is, what are we doing next week? And the teacher might have said, well, we're going to be practicing ordering food and drink. And I could have gone and learned un croissant café, s'il vous plaît. I mean, it's not very advanced, is it? But
You showed up those posh kids.
For sure, exactly.
Put them in their place.
Well, and I think actually that's what they'd done. In the summer, they had done exactly what that South Korean kid had been doing.
True.
They'd gone and learned some French before the term began. And those are the sorts of absolute gems you get from the kids that I think, student voice and staff voice, listening is a really powerful tool.
Yeah, absolutely. Really really interesting examples on it. And it kind of brings me into what I wanted to ask you about next, because this idea of the voice feedback that you're getting from the children in the room, and also, as you say, the staff in the room, that those are some examples at a micro level. But on a macro level, I know that, the value of feedback and research is really high to the work that you do. I just wanted to get a sense of how that feedback, research into what the kids have to say, the teachers have to say, how that helps formulate your learning strategies, and also how you constitute what amounts to, the right kind of feedback, how you go about gathering it, and what that sort of research element looks like.
Well, feedback is one of the really good examples of what we mean by challenging learning, and that is that all students receive feedback, all staff give feedback, and the evidence in literally thousands of studies and many hundreds of meta-analyses is that feedback makes a significant difference to student learning. Now, if you know about or are a fan of effect sizes that John Hattie's made very well known.
Yeah.
So the typical amount of growth in 1 year as an effect size is 0.4. So anything more than 0.4, you're doing pretty well. Anything less than 0.4, then perhaps you're not learning as much as you might be expected. Now, there's lots of caveats to it, and we have to be careful about effect sizes. It's one of the factors that you would look at in education, in the way that blood pressure is one thing you would look at in your health, but it's certainly not the be-all and end-all, but nonetheless, it's quite an important factor. So take the hinge point of 0.4. Well, when you look at feedback, typical effect is about 0.7. So in other words, it's almost doubling the rate of learning. Now, that sounds fabulous, doesn't it? But this is where we started from, and think, well, everybody's giving feedback in school and all students are receiving feedback, and yet very, very, very few of them are making this 2 years progress in 1 year because of that feedback. Therefore, something's not right. Something's quite amiss there. And that's why we need to challenge the way learning's taking place, because we are giving lots of feedback, but they're not making the gains. And so that's why we started to dig very deeply into it and work out, well, why not? And there's many factors. One would be perhaps the most important one is far, far, far too often feedback is given at the end of a piece of work when the student has finished. Yeah. And it's typically, well, you've done this, this, and this well. You should have done that, that, and that. You could have done this better. Next time, why don't you try? Well, how open to feedback are you when you've finished? If I were to say, imagine a colleague of yours is applying for a new job, and they say, look, I'm applying for this new job. I've written the first draft of my application form. Will you take a look and see what you think and give me any advice? Now, compare that to the same member of staff, the same colleague of yours, saying, I've spent all week writing this application form. I think it's ready to go. I'm about to send it off. What do you reckon, Simon?
Yeah, all they want to hear is, it's perfect, go for it. Yeah,
for sure. Absolutely right. And that second situation is quite typical in schools. Yeah. Here's my assignment. Here's my model. Here's my performance. Here's my presentation. Here is my work I've finished. What do you think? And of course, the kids really want, just as you said there, Simon, they want the teacher to say, oh, that's great, that. I really enjoyed that. I really like the way you've done this. Well done.
Yeah.
So if we were to bring that feedback forward and put it in earlier in the process, and I don't mean right at the beginning so that the kids don't even need to think about it. You very kindly mentioned the learning pit in your introduction to me. I think we need to give students the opportunity to struggle, and I think we need to give them that opportunity to go through the learning pit. But I don't think we should wait until they're out of the pit altogether before we give them that feedback. Now, of course, there'll be people listening to this thinking, well, hang on a minute, we give feedback all the time. And of course we do. A nod, a wink, a nudge, standing next to the student or pointing at something. That's feedback. We're giving feedback all the time. But I'm talking here about the formalized feedback. There's a lot of teachers around the world who will struggle home with a huge pile of books. And typically those books are filled with completed work. And we take time to mark that completed work. And the evidence is clear. It's just not working very well at all. So what we're suggesting is give those students the opportunity to go through the learning pit. But as they are coming out the other side, not when they're in, not when they're going in, but as they're coming out the other side, at that point, let's say 2/3 of the way through the assignment or the strategy or the learning activity, 2/3 of the way through, then collect in the books, collect in the drafts, collect in the models, and then give that formalized feedback at that point so that the students have got time to do something with it. And if you have to grade, and I'm not recommending that you do grade because grading gets in the way of so many things, but if you have to grade, then you can talk about grading at that point and say, at this point here, I think you're working at a C grade, and these are the reasons. Now, if you were to change this, add this, develop that, enhance this a bit more, I think it would lift it from a C to a B. So it's that kind of conversation, and give them the time to do it before they finish so that it becomes relevant.
Yeah, that's kind of the key part of it, isn't it? This idea of perhaps not quite mid-process, but certainly during the process, because I can think of, just off the top of my head, I can think of examples like, in Ireland we have, in the final year of school, the big exams at the end of year called the Leaving Cert, but you have, in advance of those, the mock exams, and they kind of, on paper, they look like what you're talking about. The idea is you do a full set of state exams, and then they get corrected the exact same way, you get your results, and the idea is, and what teachers always say is, oh, they're just building blocks, you can look at the results here, that can build towards. But in actual fact, because they happen as full state exams, because you have the full study period before it and you sit them down, it's only natural that you're going to come out the end of a mock exam feeling like that's a completed piece of work. And if you don't do as well, there's plenty of stories, myself included, of being pretty discouraged based on how you do in those mock exams, even though the name, as it implies, says that they're just meant to be taken as stages along the road. So really the solution in that instance, as you're talking about, might be an exam or not even an exam, an assignment in its place where it's during the process that you get to stop, where you get to get that marking along the road.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've got 3 kids, and my eldest is 14, and she came back from school a few months ago, outraged that she'd been given a maths test without any warning at all. This was against her human rights.
Pop quiz, they might call it in the States.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And it was the fact that she'd been given no warning, and she's a kid who really wants to do well, and she was beside herself. And the following day, she came out of school quite happy, which was a bit of a surprise in the first instance, and said, well, how are you doing? Oh, great. Yeah, school was really good, which we don't hear that often. And said, oh, yeah, we got our maths test back. And we said, oh, great. How did you get on? And she said, I got 40%. And we were thinking to ourselves, why in the hell are you smiling then? But it was what followed. She said, and the maths teachers said, now we know where we're starting from, and we're going to be given the actual test in 2 weeks' time.
Okay.
Now, imagine how much more motivated she was. She thought, right, I've got that 40% in the bag. I know how to do that. The 60%, right, I've really got to work on that now. And the teacher had said, you'll be given the same test. Now, it won't have the same figures in it. So, for example, if the first question was long division, the first question in the next test will be long division. I'll just change up the numbers so that you can't learn the answer. But she was given that sense of, now I've got a second chance. And my son, he's the middle one, and he, a couple of years ago, he doesn't talk very much, this little fella, but at breakfast table, he was saying, Dad, we've been studying dinosaurs at school. I said, oh, hey, that sounds great. What have you learned? And he told me some things. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, when you get home from school at the weekend, we'll have a look and see what else we can find. And we did that, and he was thrilled. And actually, there happened to be an exhibition going on down in Newcastle. So we jumped on the train and went down to Newcastle, looked at this exhibition, Centre for Life. And then we came back, and he picked up every single leaflet and he took every single photograph. And he positively ran into school on the Monday morning. I mean, this is a lad who turns up pretty much just to kick a ball around and see his mates. He is not thrilled with the idea of sitting down at a desk, but off he went into school, thrilled with his life. He came back that afternoon. I said, so how did he go? And he said, oh, it was all right. I said, well, what did the teacher say when you said you'd been learning all about dinosaurs at the weekend? And he said, well, the teacher said, we've finished that topic now. And it's like, would it have taken very much 2 weeks earlier to have said, we're doing a topic about the dinosaurs. Yeah. So if you can read with your children at home about the dinosaurs, or there's an exhibition going on down in the local city, or you can borrow some books from the school library. And of course, there'll be people listening to this thinking, yeah, but what about those kids who don't have resources, who don't have parents who speak the language? Well, parents speak a language. It might not be English, or it might not be the language of the school, but they speak a language, and you don't have to learn about dinosaurs in English, for goodness sake. But they'll say, oh, yeah, but they don't have the internet. And so, well, provide opportunities then. Provide opportunities, send things back, make sure there's those opportunities in school to engage, maybe at lunchtime or like a breakfast club, get the parents involved. And to me, this is a case of trying our very best to time feedback so that we feel as if there's the opportunity to improve. That's the thing. I think far too often feedback is given at the end, and no matter how we write it, because it's at the end, students take it as a summative statement. It's a summary of what I've done. Whereas, as we well know, formative feedback helps so much more. And that is how to form the next step. So the more we can adjust that. And you asked about how else do we look at feedback? Well, there's many things. So being very, very clear about what the criteria is that we're going to use for that feedback, making sure that feedback is received as advice rather than a conclusion or a judgment, but it's advice. Make sure there's time to use that advice before you finish. Now, of course, you can't do that in exams because that would be cheating, but you can do that the rest of the time. And, there are secondary teachers who will say to me, what you've just suggested is tantamount to cheating. And I'm like, what do you mean cheating? Well, you're going to help them do better as a result of your feedback. And I think, well, certainly hope so. Otherwise, what was the point of the feedback?
The entire point, yeah.
Now, of course, you can't do that if it's an assessed piece of coursework, and you can't do it if it's an exam. But the rest of the time, that's exactly what we're there for.
And think about what percentage of time in school is spent in exams versus time spent out.
Absolutely.
There's no comparison. So, of course, it makes sense to bring this in outside of the exam hall environment.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And one more point on feedback is that I think there's too many leaders around the world, and I see this a lot in Australia as well, and I know a lot of your listeners are in Australia. A lot of leaders check that teachers have given feedback. And indeed, there will be teachers who are writing a lot of feedback in books because the leaders are going to check the damn thing. And you think, well, we've got this wrong. We've got this the wrong way round. We should not be looking to see if the teacher has given feedback. What we should be looking for is what was the effect? What was the impact? So this is a plea to all leaders. Please, please, please don't look to see whether your teachers have given feedback to students. Instead, look for what was the outcome of that? What was the impact? Have the students improve what they've done because of that feedback? Do they understand it better? Did they produce a better essay? Was their model improved? Let's take photographs of the model, for example. This is a photograph of the model before feedback. This is a photograph of the model after the feedback was received and applied. Here is a photocopy of the essay before the feedback, and here it is after the feedback was applied. Or you use different color pens, or you engage markup in your Word documents. In other words, let's look for impact. Let's look for effect. Let's look for outcome, not look for what has been done. And I think too often teachers are writing lots of feedback because they know it's going to be checked. Whereas if we look for what is the outcome, then we could still write it if we want, but we could speak it. I mean, hell, we could sing it if we really want. But the point is, did the students understand it and apply it? That's the key.
Hey folks, hope you're enjoying the episode so far, and we've got plenty more to come after this quick break. Here at Atomi Brainwaves, we're all about education. And not just for students, for ourselves too. We would love to hear from you, whether that's feedback on one of our episodes or a question you'd like to see answered by one of our guests or by Sue. So, if you've got a comment or a question, don't hesitate to email us at brainwaves@getatomy.com. Looking forward to hearing from you. In the meantime, let's get back to it. Yeah, definitely makes the most sense for it to be outcomes to me the most important factor here, and really fascinating stuff there on feedback, on how such a role it plays when used correctly and at the right stage in the process, both as a motivator and to orient students and where they are in a learning process. But we're going to carry ourselves forward a bit and move into, I guess, the main course, if you will, of the chat, the challenging learning process. Now, we've already covered a bit of this, obviously, so far in the chat. It's popped up here and there, but I wanted to for us to get a deep dive into the weeds of the challenging learning process as outlined by yourself and the challenging learning group. And we'll start off by we've covered a little bit of the reasoning behind the challenging learning process, but we'll if we can cover that ground a little bit again, and then also move into, what exactly the challenging learning process involves for teachers and for students on a day-to-day kind of basis.
Sure. Well, there's two aspects to it. So the challenging learning process is what we do with schools, what we do with early childhood settings and with TAFEs, colleges, and so on. And that is, we realize that a keynote or a one-day workshop is not going to make very much difference. We hope to inspire, we hope to challenge, we hope to encourage, but generally speaking, staff then go back to the classroom and they're busy, busy people. We know that change takes time. We know that developing our pedagogy takes time. And so it's really important that we take part in a process, not a program. So the process is, we'll find out where you're at, we'll find out where you want to go, and we'll design together the steps that will get you there. So that's a process, that's not the program. It's not here is the answer, or here is a package of things, or here is a script that we'll read out to you. We always start with where the school or the early childhood centre or the college is at. We always look to see where do you want to go with it, and then we work with leaders, we work with coaches, we work with staff on a coaching action learning cycle where we give some ideas, then the staff are expected to try those ideas. Their coaches support that and drive that through the school. And then we go back again to find out how you're getting on. We do sort of a tweaking exercise where we're listening to the challenges that they've had, and we're doing some problem solving together. And we're looking for all the time, are we getting close to where we want to be? So that's one part of it. And then where the learning pit comes in is we know that typically learning is a challenge, and that sometimes you feel as if you're getting worse before you get better. A classic, very classic example would be many of us will type pretty fast with just 2, 3, 4 fingers. If we were to take time to learn how to touch type using all of our digits, almost certainly our typing speed would drop significantly to begin with before it became much, much better. And
been through that process.
Okay.
That example rings true with me. I'm a pretty good typer now, but I definitely remember when I started trying to use all the fingers, it was so frustrating. Yeah.
For sure. And golf fans will know that, for example, Tiger Woods, throughout his career, I perhaps ought to be using Rory McIlroy as an example for your good self. Certainly on the island of Ireland.
On the island, close enough.
For sure. But nonetheless...
Shane Lowry, actually, why don't we go with
there
him?
you go.
Yeah, a little closer to home.
There you go. But each time, if I go back to Tiger Woods, he had to change his golf swing because the way in which his physique was changing, he was getting a bad back. He felt as if he couldn't rely so much on power anymore, and he had to change his swing. And of course, he got worse before he got better, and then he got a lot better. Mm-hmm. And that was this idea of going through the pit. You do get worse before you get better. So here's the thing, back to the challenging learning process. Far too often, people go along to a workshop or a conference, and they're all inspired by these ideas. And then they go back into the classroom to try them. And the first couple of times, wow, this is great. But then it starts to slow. And then you start thinking, well, what about the equity piece here? That we've got some students who aren't engaged in it, or some students are now confused. Or let's say you do something about growth mindset. All of a sudden, teachers stop praising kids because they've heard that praise is bad, or they only praise effort. And well, actually, if you only praise effort and the kids are putting effort into the wrong thing, then why on earth would you praise it? And you start to get confused, and you start to go into the learning pit. And that is this sense of confusion and feeling that you're doing worse. And so a lot of people at that point give up. Whereas there is so much more to be gained by going through that and out the other side. And so that's why we work long term with people. I had a very nice life 10, 15 years ago. I would visit Australia 2 or 3 times a year. I'd be working in Scandinavia a lot, the UK, and doing lots and lots and lots of things with people, having an enjoyable time. But I started to get quite dispirited by it all, because although the reception was very nice at the time, and it would always be the early adopters who would stay in touch, and that gave me a false impression of how useful my work was to people. But if I'd go back to a school the following year, it turned out that actually it was a disappointingly low number of teachers who were still using the approaches and who had used it to transform their pedagogy. Most people said, oh, yeah, it was a good day. Yeah, we enjoyed that. But then there was nothing else that followed. And I think we get to a point where we want impact. We want legacy. We want to make sure that this will continue on and on and on and on. And that's not about legacy in terms of the great I am. It's more about legacy in terms of, well, it's got to be worthwhile.
Yeah.
We're spending a lot of money, public money, on training staff. If you have 100 teachers in your high school and you have a day training, and there's often 5 days training in a year, imagine the economics of that.
Yeah.
So we've got to make it worthwhile, and just having a nice day isn't good enough. I think we have to see the impact with the students in the classroom on the teacher's pedagogy, on the teacher's passion and love for their profession. We have to see that in a long term. And it's going all the way back to the beginning of this interview. You asked me my life story, and I just felt school was, so much of it was, the shelf life was so short. I felt as if I was being given information that was not even going to last till I left school, never mind into my adulthood. And even then I was annoyed and frustrated by that lack of shelf life. And so then I found myself, here I am, a one-man band consultant trawling around the world, having a lovely life. But the shelf life was so short.
Yeah.
We'd have a nice day, and maybe that would last for a couple of weeks or so, and the good feelings, and the early adopters would keep going and so on. But the vast majority didn't, because then it was back into the classroom, it was back into the damn reports you have to fit in, and then you've got the NAPLAN, and then so on and so on and so on. And it's, how do we make this last so much longer and become much, much, much better value for money as well? We've got a long-term project going in West Aurora, just outside of Chicago right now. And one beautiful side effect that we hadn't anticipated was they've got less staff sickness because of this. They're more engaged. People are more engaged, and they're enjoying their profession more, and the students are engaged more. And so staff have been off less. And guess how much money that saves on substitute teachers, So
quite a bit, I can imagine. Yeah.
So it's about the long term, and that's why we go challenging learning process. It can't be a program. One size does not fit all. We can't do the same thing to people, but it has to be a process, and it has to be long term to make sure, absolutely sure, this is going to stick. And I think most teachers, maybe even all teachers, but certainly the vast majority of us, are able to pull the rabbit out the hat when we need to, when we've got a visitor in the classroom, when we've got an inspection, when there's some key thing. Generally, most of us can turn on a really good lesson.
Yeah, flip that switch.
Yeah, exactly. The key is, what do we do when we're knackered? When it's that the kids haven't been out all week because the weather's been atrocious, and it's getting to Friday, and you just think, you know what, let's have the whole day silent reading, because you've just had enough. It's
crawling towards the weekend.
For sure. And that's the time that we're thinking, how can we improve pedagogy in that moment? So it's almost raising the default, not raising the absolute dynamite lessons that we can all do now and again. It's how can we raise the default? So that does take time to improve our resting position.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, it's quite an admirable approach to have, to take this adaptive, not one size fits all, but rather molding to the school's needs, because I'm sure that poses difficulties in and of itself, and I'll ask you about those in a moment. But I just wanted to, obviously now, the important caveat here is, as you've said, it's not one size fits all. So any example is going to really not tell the full story, but tell the story of the school in question. But I was wondering if you could, outline for us maybe just one example of a particular school that springs to mind for whatever reason, just to kind of get a sense of the details along the steps in the process, how you were able to identify the challenges of that particular school, the goals that they wanted, and just maybe a few of the steps along the way. It can be an ongoing school, a school that's still in the middle of the process, a school that's from some point in the past, but just if there's any example that springs to mind.
Yeah, schools and groups of schools come to us for many different reasons. And sometimes it's a case of they've got a bit of funding because they're not doing very well right now. Or it is that they have got that, what shall we say, workshop fatigue, where they've gone from one consultant to another, to another, to another. Nothing really hangs together very well. And I think a lot of that happens in education right now. Others were thinking, well, we think we're doing quite well, but we'd like to know whether there are things that we can do to improve. And there's so many brilliant examples that we have come across. And in each situation, we've taken a learning walk around the school. We've been given, as it were, free rein to wander around and listen to the students, listen to teachers, ask questions, probe a little bit. And we will always then, out of our interactions as we walk around the school, the interviews we do with parents and staff and students, we then put together a report to say, this is where we think you are at. And then we meet the leadership team to say, this is where we think you're at right now. But remember, it is through our lens and our snapshot on a particular day, in a particular term, in a particular year, with particular weather going on outside. It is just a snapshot. But from our point of view, from our international experience, this is what we are seeing.
Yeah.
What do you think? And then they match it up. And one school that has done tremendously well, and we've got hundreds of them, but if I were to pick one, High Week Primary School down in Devonshire in England, and they, in that meeting, they were saying, well, actually, we think you've been quite generous there because you've probably seen some of the better experiences that kids have in this school. You haven't seen the dark recesses, and we really want to get to every corner of the school. And so through a process of our report and their wisdom of their context, we then came to an agreement about where we think it's fair to say they are. And then we identify where we think it is aspirational, yes, but possible also to get to together. And then we keep checking in, and each cycle we do that same thing. We do a learning walk and we interview people and see where we get. So in that school, now this is the area is not what you would call salubrious. I mean, obviously there's lovely parts to it as well, and there's fabulous people there. But economically, they've got challenges. And in that very first interview with parents, and we asked for a cross-section, this guy walked in and he says, well, we can't hit kids these days, so you tell us how we're supposed to parent. And we were thinking, okay. Yeah. So so we started working with the school, and we did the things that I've just mentioned to you, and we did some demonstration lessons, which is an important part of what we do, because I think there's a lot of consultants trawling around the world who say things, and the rest of us are sat there thinking, sounds great, but I bet you couldn't do it. Well, we say, look, just give us any group of students and we'll work with them, and then we'll talk about the learning together afterwards. So we were doing all sorts of things, and then the following year, we do another walk around the school and another interview, and the same dad walked in and he said, what this country needs, and we thought, oh, here he goes again, Mr. Daily Mail with far right. And he says, what this country needs is to do whatever this school is doing for these children, because my children are so much more engaged. I actually liked school, he says. I was a school dropout. I hated school, but now I'm back at school with my kids. I can't wait till they come back and we do the projects together. And it was just this sense of joy. Now, of course, every single person can tell a good story like that. And you asked for one, a good story, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many examples of this. We've got a group in southern Sweden that we've been working with. And because it's a very rural part of Sweden, a long distance from any major urban centre, as so often is the case around the world, there's a migration to the cities. And so the rural areas are left struggling somewhat. And whenever they advertised a vacancy for a teaching position, they would be lucky to get one applicant. Now we've been working with them for 3 years, and now they get 18, on average, 18 applicants per job, because there's that sense of this is a good place to be. This is exciting. We want to be part of this. And so I mentioned West Aurora before about the reduced staff sickness, and some of the schools we're working with are talking about best exam results they've had in a decade. And that's not what we do, of course. We don't focus on the exam grades. If they get better grades, then of course we're delighted, but we know that that's a byproduct of better learning.
Yeah, but it's really fascinating to see these byproducts, these not necessarily the intended goals, but it sort of hammers home the point that if you have an adaptive process that tries to mold to a school and cover what suits them, then would it be fair to say that what you end up getting is, instead of just plug in to get one outcome, and okay, maybe you get that if you plug in to suit the school, you get all sorts of outcomes across all different areas of that school. Yeah.
Yep. And we've got this COVID situation going on right now, and there's a whole group of people, maybe even the majority, who are struggling with this idea of homeschooling, and the teachers are struggling with that. How do they keep that going when they're not allowed near their students, and how do parents do it when they've got other things going on as well? And I think that is it's beginning a reset in people's minds, that actually, the things that we spend a lot of time in school, and certainly a lot of time testing, and that is knowledge, has seemingly drifted lower down the rank order, and higher up is mental health, physical health, social, emotional health. And those, of course, every teacher around the world will tell you, are fantastically important. But we are so damn busy with a curriculum that is so often stuffed full of knowledge. And why? I think partly because that's what we can test. I mean, how do you test mental health in an exam? How do you test resilience or curiosity or determination? But we can test, do you know the names of the continents? Do you know the names of presidents? Do you know when Ireland had the potato famine? We can test that, and so I think it these days we're starting to question that a little bit more, and I hope what comes out of this lockdown that a lot of us are experiencing is not a go back to normal, but a reset, a sense of, knowledge is important. Of course it is, but it's one of the things that's important. Attitudes are fantastically important. Skills are fantastically important. Emotional health, physical health. And we've got to get that balance more. And I see countries, who are saying, right, okay, well, we're not going to do the exams this year. And it'll be fascinating to see what happens next because of that. Because we've been led to believe we have to do it because the exams are coming. Well, the exams are not coming now. And
really just opens up the space,
It really does. So it's fascinating. And that's, to go back to your original question, we know that if we lead a challenging learning process with schools, with groups of schools, what we will help them to do is create a culture of learning, create a culture of curiosity, resilience, determination, joy of learning. And through that, we're going to get better exam results. We're going to have more knowledgeable, more able people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really fascinating to think about, what you're talking about there, even just towards the end, the current situation, the effect it's going to have, and what potential positives might come out of a difficult situation. And well, actually, in just a moment, we're hopefully going to get to touch on this idea of current and ongoing factors. But before we get there, I just wanted to ask you quickly about, so obviously we've talked a lot about the ins and outs of the challenging learning process and what it involves for teachers and students. And I just wanted to ask you quickly about resources and what role they might play within the process. Now that can be, online resources, which would obviously be something here at Atomi would be more towards our area of expertise, or even offline resources, the physical elements of the classroom or whatever can be brought into the room. But just what role do resources play? Do they play much of a role? How can they be used within the challenging learning process?
Yeah, we have written a series of books. We've got 9 books so far, and you mentioned that in the introduction you made. And all of those books have been written with this process in mind, so that, for example, if one school felt that their focus ought to be on improving classroom talk, then there's a book called Challenging Learning Through Dialogue that myself and my colleagues have written. And that's got a whole huge array of resources and strategies and techniques that you can use in the classroom, you can use tomorrow in the classroom. There's also the margin notes, so that you don't even need to spend a whole week reading the flaming thing. You can get the general gist and the key points in just 20 minutes by reading the margin notes. There's reflection points, there's examples of and recommendations for what you can do to lead this process through your school, and the coaching points and what you can do for professional development. So there's 9 books in the series, and they're all published as well, so you can buy them without having to be part of the process. Plus, then we've got a lot of lesson ideas and lesson resources to get students into the learning pit, to get them involved in exploratory talk more, to improve feedback, to look at what do we mean by talent, so all sorts of things. And those are available online, as well as published resources also. So but just to add, I think when you mention the word resources, I also would think of, and I'm sure you would do the same, I'd also think of the personal resources that we have.
Of course.
So, and that's what we look to do, is to build the personal resources. And that's the personal resources of the students and of the staff and the community generally. Yeah,
absolutely. Of course. And that's, everything begins and ends with the personal. So of course, the number one resource to be managed and to be used within that kind of a situation. I just wanted to ask you as well quickly about, I guess, the challenges to challenging learning, because we've talked about the process and we've heard some really amazing stories about schools that have really bought in and the changes that they've made. But I imagine coming into contact with as many schools as you do, there's every now and again you're bound to come up against some pushbacks and some problems. So I wanted to see, what would you say are the most difficult challenges you come up against in trying to bring about these changes in schools, and how would you go about overcoming these difficulties? Maybe I shouldn't be saying challenges, because then the word challenge is being it's being used in multiple difficulties. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. What are the difficulties that I guess some common ones you have to overcome?
Yeah, I think some very common difficulties would be a lot of people are engaged in short-termism, and they want the quick fix. And Australia isn't quite so bad, actually. And I mention Australia, as you say, you've got a lot of your listeners from Australia. They're not quite so bad when you put it up against lots of other countries. Some others really are the quick fix brigade, and if they don't see the results in the next week or two, they're not interested. And the very idea of signing up to a 2 or 3 year process is almost it's almost beyond
shocking.
Shocking. That's a good it is shocking. And the funding is not set up that way. And there's also that sense of what we are doing is developing pedagogy and student attitudes and the culture of learning. And that's really difficult to see. often to begin with. You can feel it. It's a palpable sense of change, but you can't quite put your finger on it sometimes.
Yeah.
And we have got ourselves into a world where if we can't measure it, it's almost as if it doesn't matter quite as much. And if it doesn't change things immediately, then, well, we haven't got the time, we haven't got the patience, because we've got something else. Another difficulty that we come across is change of leadership. You start with one group of leaders and you haven't quite embedded it yet, and you haven't quite got the culture going, and then there's a new leader comes along who, and this happens in politics a lot, very publicly, but it also happens in our profession, and that is new leaders want to do it their way. And it's almost out with the old, in with the new, because if you can change things, it gives the illusion of improvement. Well, change is not the same as improvement at all. And sometimes the very best thing to do is stick at it. So those are the difficulties we come across. And of course, funding is an issue, because in so many countries that in the public sector, if you don't use it, you lose it, or you don't know what you're going to get next year. It's not like in the private sector where you can put money aside for a rainy day, or you can budget for a 2 or 3 year. So there's many difficulties, but those are starting to reduce bit by bit as we are gathering more and more evidence of impact. When people are going to see those schools and those districts and those networks of schools that have been working for 2, 3, 4 years now, and they can see a major impact. But nonetheless, there's those difficulties, and of course, present situation.
Yes,
that adds a whole new level of difficulty, and people are so uncertain of what's next. And of course, countries are spending huge amounts of money to prevent mass unemployment. But I suspect then there'll be huge cuts to public sector funding, certainly to teaching, because very, very, very unfortunately, and I think very wrongly, when we talk about frontline staff, we almost entirely think of the emergency services, and of course they are right at the very tip of the spear there. But nonetheless, there are a huge number of teachers who are putting their lives and their families' lives at risk by keeping schools open so that key workers' kids can be looked after and taught, so that the key workers can do their job. And so I don't think there's enough recognition of that right now, and I worry very much that when governments start to lick their wounds and look for ways to claw back the money, of course taxes will rise, but I think public sector funding will be cut, and I worry that education will be the first of the public sector professions to be cut, because they haven't been seen quite so
publicly,
visibly. Yeah, in this. So there's difficulties all around. To me, the main thing is hold your nerve and believe in your people, and believe in the process, and know that it is a process, not a package, and that this will be, it is adaptable, and it is, we're always going to have to be teaching, and we're always going to have to be learning. I mean, if this process teaches, this situation teaches us nothing else, it should teach us that we've all got to be damn good learners.
And as you say, definitely difficulties to be overcome, some which have been ongoing for many years, some arising out of the current situation, but you would think that an organization so used to adapting and creating creative solutions for the schools is well placed, I guess, to tackle these. The last thing I wanted to ask you about, the last thing we've got time for, is I want you to get out your, we've touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to see if you could get out your crystal ball and look into the future for us a little bit, and talk a bit about the changes you can see for the challenging learning process in particular, but even just for approach to education in general, if we want to go more broad, because we've talked about factors. I mean, the current situation is obviously with COVID that springs most clearly to mind, but there are a lot of developments going on in the world, new resources popping up every day. We've got developing educational strategies, factors like this, which are, and also shifting attitudes, which are, changing the approach to education in lots of places all the time. So what impact do you see that having for this idea of challenging learning going forward, and how will it be a positive change? How are things going to develop in the years to come? It's a broad, vague question, I know, but
Sure. Yeah, there's very many ways in which I think things continue to develop. But if I might reflect back just in the last few years, if that is anything to go by, I've noticed quite a dramatic shift towards looking for impact, and less about the teaching and more about the learning, less about the input and more about the output. And I think that is right and it's proper. It's that age-old joke of two fellas in the pub and they're saying, one says to the other, "I've taught my dog to whistle," and the other's one, "That's amazing, let's hear him." And the dog goes, "Woof." He says, "Oh, I thought you said you taught your dog to whistle." I said, "I did teach him. I didn't say he'd learned how to." And I think in recent times, we've seen a shift away from the emphasis on teaching and much more to learning. Have the kids learned this? Have the staff learned this? That's been a good shift, but we are novices still on that. And you can see that in terms of this idea that therefore everything has to be measured. And if you can't measure it, you don't know the impact, and therefore there is no impact. How happy are the kids, or how much more fulfilled are they, or how much more engaged are they, or how much better are they as citizens, or how much more physical or emotional, or how much more imaginative are they? How on earth do you know that? And I think the introduction of effect sizes into the daily conversation amongst leaders, particularly, but teachers generally, I think has been, on the one hand, positive, because it has reminded us that there are some things that make a much bigger difference than others. But the downside is then some people have taken that a bit too extreme and think that you have to measure everything, and if you can't, then it doesn't matter. So I hope that if we're to crystal ball gaze, I hope that we will mature in our outlook on this and start to think much more about what do we mean by outcomes and what outcomes are we looking for. And just because we can't see them doesn't mean they're not happening. I hope that we don't go back to the laissez-faire response of, well, because we can't measure it, there's no point even asking the question, so let's forget it, let's just keep doing what we're doing. I think we still have to keep asking, what's the outcome here? I think we still have to ask those long-term questions. But I also think we need to keep reminding ourselves there's a lot of things we're not going to ever know, for sure. So I think that that's going to be a change. I think technology, more and more and more, now that we are over the shiny toy syndrome and much more into the, okay, but how can it enhance West Aurora that I mentioned earlier, we're working with, they've got a classroom in each school where they've got lots and lots and lots of little cameras in so that you can go in and teach a lesson and then watch what's going on. And it's not just the one camera, it's lots of cameras. So you can see from lots of different angles, and so that you can see learning from the student's point of view. And I hope that, I know time's short here, I think the motto that we often use in our company might be a good one to finish, and that is, proving is good, improving is better.
Okay.
And I hope that's where we can head. That, yeah, I hope we can prove that we're able to do this, that I'm able to teach that I'm able to show that. But I hope that we focus much more on the improving, and that plays itself out in the classroom as well. Don't come to this classroom to prove what you can do. Come to this classroom to improve what you can do. And right now with the COVID situation, let's not get involved in proving what I can do with technology. Yeah. Let's get much more involved in improving what I can do, what my students can do, what we can do together. So proving is good, improving is better.
Yeah, it's an excellent motto, and it's kind of a hopeful message for the future, which I think we can all agree with. That is all we have time for in discussion on our main topic. However, we always like to finish our episodes by asking our guests for a little bit of advice or maybe a little anecdote for the teachers out there. It can be something specifically to do from your own experience in teaching. It doesn't even necessarily have to do with that, but just something that you think either a little anecdote or piece of advice for the teachers out there that you think might go down well. So what have you got for us today?
Well, put me on the spot there, Simon. But,
I know. Well, just whatever springs to mind. It doesn't have to be profound. It can be silly. Sure. It can be anything.
I'm not sure anything I'm going to say is profound, but
I beg to differ. But
anyway. Oh well, thank you. I would say, it's a learning pit story, if I may, and that I was having a drink in my local pub and nipped off to the toilets as you do, and it's one of those old pubs with the toilets right out in the car park, for the blokes, and pretty dark, and I heard this voice coming out of the dark, "Hello, sir," and I thought, oh hell, and there was that certain amount of menace in his voice, and I thought, who in the hell's this? And it turned out to be this lad Gary that I used to teach, and he was 17, 18 by then, something like that, and so I said, come on, I'll buy you a pint, and we sat down and we were chatting, and I said, what was school like for you then, Gary? He says, I hated it, absolutely hated it. I says, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Why? He says, well, that learning pit that you taught us about, I spent my flipping life in that pit. He says, the teachers would start talking, I'd get all confused, I'd get into that pit, and then the teachers would say, so, moving on then. And he said, I used to think to myself, what do you mean moving on? Don't leave me, I'm here in the pit. And I said, yeah, I've had experiences like that too, Gary. I says, did you hate all of school? He says, oh, no, I love those learning pit lessons that you did with us. And I said, you just said you hated being in the pit. He said, no, I hated being in the pit by myself. But when you got us all into the learning pit, I used to think to myself, welcome to my world. Let me show you around. And he says, I was that used to being in the learning pit that I was able to show all these clever dicks who thought that they knew the answers all the time. I was able to show them how to deal with that uncertainty and that confusion. And then he told me his life story, and he'd left school at 16 and with no qualifications, and he'd started a window cleaning business that same day. And by the time I was talking to him, and as I say, he was 17, 18, something like that, he was employing all these staff all over the region. Now, there's a kid with no qualifications. There's a kid who was always confused in class, and yet there was also a kid who was resilient, who had that sense of determination, who thought to himself, oh yeah, well, problems happen, stuff comes at you all the time, and just deal with it and get on with it. And I found that absolutely fascinating, and particularly when he told me about his best friend who was at the other end of the spectrum, and he'd got top grades throughout, and he'd gone to a top university and then dropped out in the first term because... And I said, why do you think that was, Gary? And he says, well, I just think he didn't know how to fail. He didn't know what to do with failure. And I thought about that long and hard. And I think when I was doing research for my book, Challenging Mindset, one of the fascinating things I found about growth mindset is actually it's our attitude towards failure that has arguably one of the biggest impacts on students' mindsets. And the more we treat failure as the end of the road, the more likely they are to get into a fixed mindset. Whereas the more we treat failure as a learning situation that causes us to take a different path, the more likely we are to end up in a growth mindset. So I find that fascinating, and it's something I'm looking into a lot more, is how can we talk about mistakes and failure and not try to fail, not try to make mistakes, but how do we approach them with a sense of we can learn from this? And I hope that suits as a final story, Simon.
Oh, it absolutely does. It's a wonderful anecdote. Maybe Gary's listening. Who knows? Also,
Hope
who
so.
knows? Maybe it was your lessons in the learning pit that set him on this successful path in life. Who can say for certain? Yeah. But either way, a wonderful little anecdote. Listen, James, thank you so much for coming on and chatting to us. It's been an absolute pleasure. To everybody out there, if you want to listen to any other of our episodes, you can find them on whatever platform you're listening to this on, or check us out on our main site at getatomy.com. For now, though, it is goodbye from James.
Thank you very much, Simon. Been a pleasure.
And goodbye from me. See ya.